Hello, today we're going to be talking about Reconstruction. This is the time period after the Civil War where the country had to repair itself. We're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about relationships, and we're talking about bringing the North and the South together again. This time period was from 1863 to 1877. Now, towards the end of the Civil War, the entire South was practically destroyed, especially with Sherman's march to the sea. And what he did is he marched right through Georgia and burned everything. So most of the land in the South was destroyed, and it all needed to be rebuilt. So this would also be part of Reconstruction. Now, there were different plans for Reconstruction. President Lincoln had a plan, Andrew Johnson, who was his vice president, had a plan, and then the Republicans in Congress had a plan. President Lincoln's plan would be the easiest. He wanted to make it so easy because the nation needed to come together. His idea was that any southern state with at least 10% of the voters making a pledge to be loyal to the United States could be readmitted. They also, of course, had to accept the ban on slavery. Now, that took a little bit of time for some of the southern states. And you'll see in this map here that the war actually ended in 1865, but if you look here at Virginia, for instance, it didn't come back into the Union until 1870, so that took 5 years. North Carolina came back in 1868, and so on. So you can look at this map, and these are the southern states. Also, Reconstruction, as we talk about infrastructure, that would be roads, government, all kinds of things. We also need to think about what was the nation going to do with all these newly freed slaves. The 13th Amendment was passed to the Constitution, and that was the freedom of slaves. Slavery became illegal in the United States of America. Unless you were a criminal, and you could be held in contempt in prison, but you could not hold a person against their will and have them do work for you, unless, of course, they were criminals in prison. The Freedmen's Bureau was a really important agency that was established by Congress to give aid to 4 million newly freed African Americans and also some poor whites that were living in the South that everything they had was ruined during the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food, housing, medical aid, legal assistance, and it established schools educating slaves. Prior to the freedom of slaves, African Americans were not even allowed to learn how to read. So this is very important. Now, President Lincoln, darn it, I did it again. He was elected for a second term. And on March 4th, 1865, he laid out his approach for Reconstruction in his second inaugural address. He really wanted to reunite the nation, and this is from his inaugural address: with malice and hatred toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow, and for his orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Now, you may have heard that before, but that is from his second inaugural address. Now, 6 days after the war ended, Lincoln was assassinated. And while he was watching a play in Ford's Theater, and John Wilkes Booth came in and shot him. He did not die immediately, but he died shortly thereafter. There was really a conspiracy for this whole thing, which we can talk about at a different time. But Vice President Andrew Johnson was set to be assassinated, along with Abraham Lincoln, and then the Secretary of State, John Seward, who was actually shot, but he lived. So Vice President Andrew Johnson was not harmed, but he obviously became president because he was the vice president, and now Abraham Lincoln was dead. During this time, Abraham Lincoln would have been considered a Republican or a Whig. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. And so it was different than our presidential elections run now. But Andrew Johnson was actually from the South. He was a Democrat. Although he was not for the Civil War, he wanted the Union to remain united. So here's a little picture here for you. Okay, so then we're going to talk about the Black Codes. These are restrictive laws put into place during Reconstruction. And when I say states, I mean southern states. So many southern states required African Americans to have written evidence of employment. And if they didn't, they would be disciplined. They could only work as farmers or servants unless they paid an annual tax of anywhere from $10 to $100. So you can imagine, if you are a farmer or a servant, you're not going to make enough money to pay that tax. So you're stuck there being a farmer or a servant. If you were homeless, there were heavy penalties. And the primary purpose of these black codes was to restrict labor and activity. Breaking a contract by an African American could result in arrest, beating, or forced labor. Other laws were passed to keep blacks from voting. And there's like a poll tax. They weren't allowed to vote, even though they were supposed to be able to vote, and we'll talk about that. And these black codes also developed into what we call Jim Crow laws. They're very similar. Okay, so we talked about Abraham Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. The Republicans, we call them radical Republicans, but they were really angered by the black codes in the South. So they felt like that the South needed to be punished for this. Where Abraham Lincoln wanted everybody to come together and reunite as a nation, the radical Republicans wanted the South to change more before they could be readmitted. And they felt like President Johnson really let the South off too easy because he was Southern himself. Okay, so remember that we said the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship. Now, this is important. Citizenship for all people born or naturalized. Naturalized means you immigrated here and became a citizen within the US, except for Native Americans. They were not allowed to be citizens, which is ironic. So the 14th Amendment is about citizenship. It said that state governments could not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So this meant that newly freed slaves were now American citizens because the majority of them were born in the United States. Okay. Now, remember when I said that Congress, or the radical Republicans, were angry with President Johnson because he wasn't going along with their ideas of Reconstruction. So, as a result, Congress decided to impeach President Johnson. Now, you may have heard a little bit about impeachment when we talk about former President Trump. So, let me tell you a little bit about impeachment. Okay, so impeachment are charges against a public official for misconduct. Okay, it doesn't necessarily take that official out of it doesn't strip them of any powers necessarily. It just says misconduct. So by a single vote, Republicans failed to convict Johnson. The only other time a president has been impeached was Bill Clinton. Richard Nixon resigned before he was impeached. And Donald Trump was acquitted by the Senate. So just because you say you're impeached, it doesn't mean you're going to be kicked out of office. I just want to be clear on that. Okay, So the development of the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, was in 1866. It was a secret society, and it was opposed to African Americans obtaining civil rights, and it was also opposed to Jewish people, Catholic people, and they used violence and intimidation to frighten. We think mostly of blacks, because that's what you see on TV and that's what you hear the most. But they also threatened other members of our nation, but predominantly African Americans. They would wear white robes and hoods to hide their identities. And they have murdered many, many people. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the 15th Amendment. So we said the 13th was freeing the slaves. The 14th was citizenship. Now here's the kicker. The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. And women's rights activists were furious about this because they had fought to have slaves be free. They were all abolitionists, but they were not granted the right to vote yet. So African American men and white men could vote, but not women yet. So that's the 15th Amendment. 13th is freeing the slaves, 14th is citizenship, and 15th is the right to vote for men. Okay, so segregation and Jim Crow laws. Now, Jim Crow is also an extension of the Black Codes, and we will talk more in class about who Jim Crow is. He's a fictional character. We'll talk about that in class. So, starting in 1881, so this is quite a while, quite a while after the Civil War, blacks had to stay in separate hotels, separate parts of theaters, separate rail cars, separate schools, separate everything, separate drinking fountains, separate restaurants. And this was called segregation, and it was considered legal. Jim Crow laws forced segregation. And Jim Crow laws were in place until, 1940s, maybe 50s. So then we have the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, and this is very important. When you think of Plessy versus Ferguson, think of separate but equal. So Plessy was a guy riding, he was part black, he passed himself as white and sat in the white part of a railway car. Well, they said, no, you can't sit with the white people because we know that you are partially African American. So they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal facilities were fine. That was fair. But in practice, the African American facilities were usually separate and unequal. They were unacceptable. And that didn't change until 1965, 100 years after the Civil War ended, for Jim Crow laws to be outlawed and blacks to finally realize legal equality in America. Now, they might realize legal equality in America, but is it really equality in America? That's something that we're going to discuss throughout this class. Okay, so 40 acres and a mule. During Reconstruction, ex-slaves, they were promised as compensation, you're going to get 40 acres of land and a mule. However, the government couldn't come through with their promise. That was a lot. So during the riots in the 1960s, during the civil rights movement, people were overheard saying, that's for my 40 acres and a mule, as they stole something from a store. Filmmaker Spike Lee's company is called 40 Acres and a Mule. So if you've ever watched a movie produced by Spike Lee, you can see that. It says 40 Acres and a Mule. So we're going to stop right there with this lecture. I'm sorry to keep talking and talking and talking, but hopefully you can access this again and again if you need it to study for the test. See you in class. Bye.